How about you start introducing yourself, Mike? Looks like everybody knows me already.
Yeah, Taiwo is a very popular guy here today. This is his third time up on stage. So
Yeah.
he's done a great job representing Workday. And I like to think Workday, we bring a brighter Workday. We make your Workdays better. I know conference days are a little bit different, but Workdays are good too, as long as you're using Workday. And just quick show of hands, how many people in this room use Workday? All right, that's awesome. Yeah, we love to see that. So more than 60% of the Fortune 500 uses Workday. We love seeing our customers, interacting with them. So a little bit about myself. It's nice being back in San Diego. I actually started my career here. I wasn't always in software. I started out in finance at a hedge fund up the freeway off of Del Mar Heights. And we were a shareholder activist fund that managed about $10 billion in CalPERS and CalSTRS investments. We'd only make one or two investments a year. They were average size of $1 billion stakes in public companies. So you can imagine we would do a tremendous amount of financial analysis and modeling and go super deep on every one of these investments, which worked for us, but that doesn't scale, right? As you start managing a lot more analysis in your portfolio. So after the hedge fund, I joined a company called SunPower. I was responsible for managing our solar assets, specifically the ones that were financed, owned by investors, hundreds of projects, rooftops, ground mount. And when I started that, I was like, oh, let's do the same spreadsheet approach, build some cool Excel models, do financial reporting. But, again, that's not going to scale. So I started, writing some macros to think, hey, could I automate this part? Hey, could I use Visual Basic and attach this PDF to an email and send it to the investors? And that's kind of when I fell in love with software, because I was like, man, this is a multiplier of productivity. I could do this manually, I could hire a team to do it, or I could write some code and it's just going to run on its own. And I fell in love with it so much, I ended up starting my own software company. We went through Y Combinator. One of the things as a Y Combinator-backed companies, you get a lot of cloud credits from the CSPs. Everybody wants you to build their infrastructure, on their service, whether it's AWS or GCP or others. So the first, couple of years of your life as a startup, your infrastructure costs are like free, and so it's exciting. You can build things and that doesn't go into your burn rate, but it doesn't really build a good FinOps practice internally, because you're like, this doesn't cost me anything. Eventually you start to see those costs run up, your credits deplete and then you go through them. And now that's real money. So now at Workday, I kind of get the opportunity to blend a lot of those areas of my career in helping us manage our cloud infrastructure spend at scale using software. And Taiwo's team running our FinOps practice is one of our main customers for that.
Pretty much. You've been a good partner. Let me set a bit of context and walk you through a bit of a journey into cost transparency and more so into unit economics. If anyone has been at a session yesterday, we kind of talked a little bit on this, but we didn't get here in a flash. It was a journey towards clarity and cost consciousness. Earlier on in the days, we started with the basic CSP, native billing data, just to really understand our usage. Then, as we grew our footprint on public cloud, we needed better analysis. So we bought a third-party package too. But that wasn't enough for us, because we want to really get into the why is our cost growing up? How do we attribute the cost? How do we plan? How do we forecast? We didn't know the driver. So we understood that we needed to bring our own data in, business context, to be able to understand the data better. So we partnered with a major CSP to build an homegrown visualization tool. But Mike, you probably agree that that wasn't enough. So last year, over the course of the last 18 months, we decided we're going to build our own tool. At this point, we knew that we just don't need to bring business data. We also need observability capabilities to be really understand our cost drivers so that we can pinpoint the drivers of each cost. That's where we are today.
Yeah.
Now, this is an interesting bit. Mike, you've been at Workday for about 13 months. What's your perception on how building this homegrown tool, we call it, Opus, Optimized Platform Usage and Spend, has been the adoption? How's it been like?
Absolutely. So, one of the keys to driving adoption of any process or tooling is you have to make it easy for folks, right? These these department owners that manage the spend, in some ways they're our customers.
Yep.
We're trying to drive this FinOps practice throughout the company, but if they got to jump through a bunch of hoops, it's deviate from their day job, sift through a bunch of difficult to navigate screens, it's not going to work. So we've really tried to orient Opus internally around the owners of those services, of those budgets. And so we've given kind of entry points into our platform. So before you go in, you self-identify with, hey, this is my team, this is my service, enter me into the Opus platform at the correct point. And then once you're there, everything that's relevant comes up to you. So you're not having to navigate, you're not having to sift. One thing that we've done with our tooling is it's not entirely from scratch. We built on top of open source tooling, things that are best in class, piece them together, help them scale to manage data at the Workday scale, which, as you can imagine, is pretty large. And I'll go a little bit more into the architecture of that later. But Taiwo, back to you. How does that affect our rhythm of business?
That's interesting. You can have a great tool. That's the tooling part. But how do you manage governance? So we have a cadence, what we call that rhythm of business, driving accountability at the right level. At the beginning of the year, like most enterprises, we set a budget, an annual budget. We have a long-range plan that we review every 6 months, looking 5 years ahead. But we also have quarterly ops review. How are we doing? Forecast versus budget, actual versus budget, how are we going to land the quarter? This is so important because we're Fortune 500, we report every quarter, we need to give guidance. And our public cloud cost is a good part of the expenditure. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road. I said earlier on in the keynote, we have a FinOps metadata where we have purpose hierarchy. At every business unit, we have a governance structure in such a way that a FinOps lead gets to meet with the leaders to review what are your wins for the month. We celebrate that, your optimization wins. What are your misses? Why did you breach your forecast? Did you under forecast or over forecast? What's the driver? And what are you working on? We call that the key metrics. Now, the whole idea of this is to stay on top of things to make sure that the engineers have a skin in the game, the leaders have a skin in the game, so that we can help drive profitability and be cost conscious. Now, it's not just that. We have a tight governance about new CSP account opening. I'll tell you today, Workday has thousands of AWS accounts and GCP accounts. How do you stay on top of that so that you keep your costs nimble? We have a governance process for that. Goes through in a third-party tool where you have to give business justification for this account. This ensures that we're being prudent and fiscally responsible. And we also built on Opus, Slack integration. If there's an anomaly, the platform owner, the engineer responsible gets an alert and is able to jump at it and figure out what's going on. Because with cloud billing, you get your bill at the end of the month, it's too late to take actions. So that's how we've been able to manage our public cloud financials in such a way that, our variance is usually between 1% to 3% on a quarterly basis. It takes a village to do it. Now, going further, with the tooling and process, I'd like to share with you what it means to really drive adoption and the impact. Like I mentioned earlier on, back in 2020, 2022, we had in the third-party tool CSP billing, but that didn't really tell us the full story. Engineers, because they like to build, maybe they'll know what's going on. But for product leaders and business executives, they want to be able to make decisions, make choices. By the time we built in our own business unit metrics by blending external data, by building our own tool, we saw adoption almost double. And what does that mean? It also means that our unit cost trends downward, both the operational metrics and business metrics. because everybody is now paying attention. As you can see on the graph, it's phenomenal. Just by building our own tool, bringing more data, enriching on data, getting to unit economics, which is relatable to both product leaders, business executives, and also the end users. Now, we didn't do this alone. It wasn't a vacuum. This community here has helped us a lot. We think about our public cloud, governance from learning a lot from all of you guys. So we look at the, framework, FinOps framework. How do we align based on our own use case? If you see on our heat map here, what we've been able to do is we look at each of the capability. Where do we need to invest? Where do we need to align? We have all sort of auto sessions with some of you guys here, offline from FinOps X to like, oh, we learned so much at FinOps X 2024, 2023. How did you guys do it? We have offline sessions. So we've been able to build a community to help a mature practice. I'll tell you the most important element of this is bringing everybody in the same room to really understand that having public cloud sustainability is not just one person's job. It's everybody's job. We've also partnered with the FinOps Foundation. I'll tell you a little bit story about that. Last year when we were here, we're like, FinOps certified engineer. Workday has thousands of engineers. And we're like, how do we bring this knowledge up? Yeah. And I remember having a conversation with JR, and he was like, why don't you train a bunch of your engineers? We ended up training over 100 engineers that are certified. What does that mean for us? It means that we're speaking the same language. They understand. In fact, they are more proactive. They come to us. Hey, Taiwo, I found this opportunity. Go get it done. I'll pass it on to Mike, and let's get more into the weeds of, what it means to build our unit economics.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously Taiwo's team has done a fantastic job of laying the foundation, the framework, following the best practices with the FinOps Foundation internally at Workday. So now how have we applied that to AI? Everybody knows AI is a very hot topic. It's also a very real topic in terms of how it's driving business, both in terms of external products and also internal processes, how we work internally. And within Workday, Taiwo mentioned this, he covered it to some extent on the keynote slide, but our approach to implementing AI within Workday is to use a centralized inference service. So what that means is that whether it's an internal request, from one of our developer tools or a Slack AI agent, or an external request that's powering a Workday feature, it's coming through that same internal API. And that provides some pretty cool benefits from a technical perspective, because now that request has context. And so we can understand what customer was making that request, what model we want to use for that request, what type of feature it's driving. One thing I'll point out from a Workday perspective, we're really excited about this concept of AI agents. If you think about how AI has kind of evolved, initially it's helping to answer questions, right? And kind of whether a chatbot or augmenting results from a search and informing. But really what we see as the future of it is not only the ability to answer questions, but the ability to do work. And that's what we mean by an agent. You think of it as like another employee. That's a virtual employee. And what better system to manage your virtual employees than in the same system you manage your real employees? Because you have to manage these AI agents. You can't just let them run amok with no permissions, no controls, no security considerations. And so we look at Workday as not only the platform to manage your people, but in the future, the platform to manage your virtual agents that are working and should have the same process of managing that as you would manage your people.
Now, this has been a battle between myself, jokingly, with Mike's team. How do I quantify the business value of it? My cost is growing up. How do you help me understand the cost per developer? We have all this data. At least I want to believe they reside somewhere. What does each model cost me to train? How often should I train my model? If I'm able to surface these to my ML AI engineer, maybe they will think differently. What's the inference cost for an AI? Which customers is really interacting with this inference? Do I have visibility into that? What's the cost of intersection, cost per customer, cost per AI agent? I really want to know because I want product leaders and their executives to make choices. Now, how did you solve for that?
Well, obviously there's a lot of challenges to solve for in putting this into practice.
Yep.
I mean, one of the things I've found fascinating with the rise of AI is the use of GPUs over CPUs. I don't know about you, but I remember, GPU, you only cared about it if you were a hardcore computer gamer and you wanted like the best graphics card possible, right? And so then you'd pay up for that kind of beefed up GPU. I mean, who knew that would become the primary compute mechanism for AI?
Yep.
And I mean, these LLMs, they perform incredibly well as long as they have those GPUs.
Yep.
CPUs won't cut it. Some machine learning capabilities, GPUs are fine.
Yep.
And it's important to strike that balance. Other challenges, of course, are general volatility in cloud costs, in spend. One of the ways that we help normalize that is within Opus, within the way we report out on all of our costs, we do a standard cost.
Yep.
And so what that means to us is, you don't just look at it for that individual point in time, because let's say you have credits and that actual cost was zero. It doesn't mean it costs you nothing to run that compute or run that service. It just means at that particular point in time, some credits kicked in. But that's not always going to be the case. So we always normalize that over a longer period of time so that you can look at the cost as it's going to impact the company's spend over the course of a week, a quarter, a year, and not just particularly that point in time.
Yep.
So everything we report out, it's always using the standard cost adjustment, which again, over time, it ends up being the same cost. We bring that kind of target cost index basically to 1, but it gives you a representative run rate of that. So that's how we solve for volatility. One of the other things that's important when it comes to AI is, you don't necessarily have all the data that you need out of that billing data set, right? Workday, we use Kubernetes heavily. I think you've probably all heard about Kubernetes a lot at this conference. It's very widely used. Workday is multi-cloud. We run heavy workloads on AWS, on GCP. I think we're within one of the top spenders on each, probably from cloud infrastructure. We also have our own internal data centers. So a lot of our customers are still their tenants are hosted in private data centers that Workday manages and is continuing to run. We view this as an advantage because it allows us to really pick and choose the best service and the best cost, to deliver that better experience to the customer. We're not locked into, hey, it has to be this one way. We have the ability to move across. But that also means that we need to do a little bit more work to kind of normalize this data. And so we've invested in this data pipeline. I won't get too much into the individual tools that drive it, because this isn't technically a software talk, but 3 elements, they're all open source. Trino, this was actually open sourced by Facebook a while ago, and it's since become a standard distributed way to query data across lots of different sources. And AWS and GCP being some of them. So we've implemented the focus specification as kind of our starting point for how we abstract and then normalize that data, but then we enhance it. And we do that enhancement through a tooling called DBT. It stands for Data Build Tool. If you've worked in data engineering, it's very common as a way to organize your transformations. Think of every transformation as a SQL model that's joining additional pieces of information, or it's doing an aggregation, or it's unioning pieces together. But it's all the in-between stuff that happens in that pipeline before we go and present it in the presentation layer. Lastly, for our presentation layer, we use a tool called Lightdash. It's open source. It's incredibly flexible. We use this pipeline not just for our FinOps use case within Workday, but also for general customer health and understanding kind of reliability of our infrastructure and our internal servers. So it really helps us serve a lot of different use cases across the company in a very reliable and scalable way. Now, what do we mean by this additional information? So, initially, we were most focused on what is that kind of business hierarchy, right? Who owns this account? Who's the executive that it rolls up to? What's the purpose of this? So we understand, why are we spending this money, right? But to get into the nitty-gritty of AI, you've got to go a little bit deeper. So you've got to dig into your Kubernetes information too. Because Kubernetes, again, super high level, you've got these nodes. That's the actual physical unit of compute. That's a little server running somewhere in a data center. You've got these pods, and that's how you kind of allocate different pieces of a given process to those nodes, and then you have containers. And to really know what this unit of compute that you're paying for is actually doing, you've got to traverse those levels. And we do an expansion of that when we get to AI, because it's not just, hey, this is running an AI workload. It's, well, what model was it running? What feature is it serving? Is this an internal request? Is it an external request? This is all information that, because we route our inference requests through this central inference service, we have that information to go map it up. And this is kind of an overview of the stages we go through when we map that. So again, we start with our raw cost data coming from the CSPs, and we match it up with our Kubernetes information. So this is so we can understand which pods we're running on those nodes that we're paying for. Now, to go deeper on the AI side, we use a service called Ray. Ray allows you to basically manage different AI model workloads within a pod. So we see a pod, we're like, hey, Ray is managing this pod. So now to go deeper into that, we now query the Ray service and the metrics that it produces around how it was scheduling that information. And now we can use that to break out the cost by LLM, the cost by feature. We know whether this was a GPU or a CPU. Again, we know which customer was requesting this. The other thing it allows us to do, and similar to how we're a bit agnostic on which cloud service provider we utilize, we're also a bit agnostic on whether we internally host this model or we externally don't host this model. So if you think about it, if you know that you're going to have a given volume of requests that's all going to use this model, it can be cheaper to run that on your own infrastructure, right? You reserve the capacity, you can get discounts for kind of pre-purchasing that capacity, and now you have this ready and available to route requests through. And you can see the cost of our internally hosted models in blue. It tends to be relatively stable. The risk of that, of course, is like, let's say we overestimated, right? We spun up resources, we train models, we have them running, but we're just not getting a lot of requests to that, right? So that's over-provisioned capacity that now we can save by kind of either retiring that model, scaling down that infrastructure. So we view this as giving us kind of the best of both worlds, because we have a nice baseline in what we can serve at a relatively low cost, but then we can meet those spikes in demand, right? We can send that overflow to externally hosted models. We don't have to run everything through an internally hosted one. The other thing that this service allows us to do, which again I think is pretty cool, is it allows us to run experiments. Because we're LLM agnostic, we don't have to continue using the same Anthropic or the same Gemini or this, and again, like it's evolving constantly, right? You always hear about it in the media. Hey, there's this new LLM out there that's just blowing everything else away. It's like, well, we want to benefit from that, right? Why not? So one thing our machine learning team does is behind the scenes of a request, we'll send a request. Hey, I need inference. I need a response. We return that response quickly, but after that, we go send it off to 20 other LLMs, and we compare the cost of running that request, the latency. We can look at the quality and the accuracy of that. And so we're constantly refining that. Yes, today I serve this request using this LLM, but I found there's this new one out here that was number 19 of the 20 I ran this experiment with that actually delivers a better combination of cost and latency. And so we can use that to continue to refine which LLM we're using under the hood to service all these requests across Workday.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road. Mike, we've had this conversation severally. The FinOps team is not going to keep adding new workmates. It's not sustainable. Our cloud cost is growing. Visibility is democratized across the enterprise. A lot of people are asking questions. The question in my mind is, I'm not going to have 10 dedicated resources to build charts. We already have a developer productivity hub because we have GitHub Copilot. What are you going to do for me to help scale our FinOps practices, leveraging AI capabilities? And how do I get to a point where I don't have to chase anyone? It has to be automated in such a way that they will get a notification. I just want to see the reporting of what actions they're taking. How are we going to get that done?
Yeah, and this is an interesting transition, right? Because we've been talking about FinOps for AI. Mm-hmm. Now, what about flipping that? What about AI for FinOps? And so there's a few ways that we're approaching that internally. So, one of them is, because we have all this well-labeled data around, what these cost categories are, what they mean, what service is driving it. It's really easy, relatively speaking, for an LLM to understand that. And one thing that I find is pretty cool about LLMs, and if you think about this from a perspective of an API, APIs used to require a lot of documentation, and I mean they still do, but you're like, you have to speak to me in this very specific way, otherwise I'm not going to understand you. And when folks went out to create LLMs, they're targeting AGI, right? Like artificial general intelligence. And so they're thinking about, how would you speak to a person, right? And you wouldn't ask a person, hey, what's your documentation for how to talk to you? I mean, maybe sometimes you do, but generally, you can just talk, right, the way you would talk. And that's how all these LLMs are structured. It's a prompt, you provide a context, but you can speak to it. And that's the same way that we can train our agents internally when answering FinOps questions, is we can use this persona of a FinOps analyst, and we can tell it, hey, you are a FinOps analyst. You are using all these procedures. You are trained on all the FinOps Foundation best practices. How would you answer this question? And you can think of it as, having these instantly scalable virtual employees that you can plug in anywhere. And I know that sometimes that concept is a little bit scary for people that are the employees. You're like, are they going to replace me? Right?
Not exactly.
And,
it's about scaling up our FinOps practice.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is, if you're going to have 10,000 customers from 200, how do I scale? Humans still have to be behind the scene to make some certain strategic and critical decisions, but I want to be able to scale my practice.
Yeah.
It's not replacing humans, just to be clear.
And the way I like to think about it, right? So, what LLMs I don't think, and agents I don't think will ever replace is the accountability.
Yeah, accountability is key
for this, right? And if you think about it, if these agents are humans, then they're on your team. You're still responsible for training them. You're still responsible for the output they produce. And in one way, it gets rid of this concept of individual contributors at a company, and now everybody is a manager. They may be managing agents,
manager of agents. That's what
and
I want
not
to
people. But think about the way that can scale work across the company. Everybody is a manager that has this team of highly trained, knowledgeable employees at their disposal. That's pretty cool. And again, but going on to the FinOps use case. So, we want these analysts to be highly trained on not just general FinOps practice, but like our specific data, and answer questions about our specific data. And this is an area that we're working with the Lightdash team in training these AI agents, empowering them with information that's specific to our usage, our costs, how we separate things from a business hierarchy, and how we want to ultimately give this answer. And again, these are answers that they're going to be the best answer that the LLM can give. It may not always be right. You use any of these services, you always see a disclaimer. Hey, you're using Gen AI. Warning: the answer might be wrong. And I don't think that warning is going to go away.
It's never going to go away because accountability still resides with you.
It's still on you, right? I mean, if you get a bad answer from Gemini and you go act on it and something goes wrong and it costs money, like, are you going to be able to sue Google for that? No, because they told you that was on you. Like, I'm giving you the best answer I can give you, but you have to validate it. And I think that's going to continue to be the relationship with us and LLMs. It's this, trust but verify relationship. And again, I think you do that with people on your team. You're going to have to do that with LLMs. And just one last thought on this. I mean, I've found that sometimes the last people to adopt AI are the ones that actually know what it's doing the best. Because they're like, I can do this. I've done it. And so why would I trust something else to do it for me? Has anyone, just one more quick question, has anybody taken the Chartered Financial Analyst exam? It's the CFA designation. Nice. Yeah. So it's pretty hard. And one of the things that make it hard is, they make you use like one of two calculators. It's a Texas Instruments BA2 Plus or a HP12C. It's intentionally super limited, right? Because the exam is testing, like, do you know this? Do you actually, like, can you answer this without relying on some powerful technology? Now, would you use that calculator in practice at your work? Of course not. No. Like, you could be way more productive, running these calculations in Excel or using SaaS tools, and but it's still important to verify that you know it, right? Because how else would you be in a position to verify the output that the LLM is giving, or train it, right? So that's how I sleep at night, knowing that LLMs they're coming, AI agents are coming, but we still have a purpose, as people. We got to understand the work. We got to be accountable for it.
All right. Thanks, Mike. It's been a great partnership. And I'll say thanks. I mean, for you guys that are FinOps practitioners, this has been a phenomenal partnership with our engineering partners at Workday. We couldn't have gotten here without having close network and partnership with them to help us build the tools we need for our context. Thanks, Mike, again.
Hey, you mentioned that you do experimentation across more than 20 models, and you vet that for quality, latency, and cost. 2 of those can be measured really easily. For quality, are you doing that manually? Do you have tools, and are you using AI to do that? Or what does quality mean in terms of that validation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the things I'll say about the way we built our platform is, there are subject matter experts on our machine learning team that are building their own models, and they're using those output, and not models like LLM models as in data models that's presenting information to their team that they then use to make decisions. And so the specifics of exactly how they're validating the quality and the accuracy of that response, I don't know. I would have to defer to the ML team on that. But again, I think that's part of what's cool about the way that we built this is we don't have to be the subject matter expert on everything that our Opus platform reports out. We open it up to subject matter experts to contribute their own models, to contribute their own analysis, to create their own dashboards, and so we don't become the bottleneck of having to do it all for them. We'll validate it, right? It's everything is source controlled, so all the new SQL models that come in, they come in through a GitHub pull requests, and our team's responsible for making sure it's not going to like bring down the whole pipeline if we merge this in. But it enables kind of these other teams within the company to get that more sophisticated data that's going to allow them to take the next steps in their areas of expertise.
I'll add a little bit to that from a practitioner standpoint. It's incredibly difficult for you to scale a FinOps team without democratizing access. So in our practice, what we have enabled a business unit, we train them, this is how DBT works with engineering, this is how FinOps work, but you can bring your own data. Merge your own business data, create your own dashboard, do your cost allocation, we will guide you. And that has worked phenomenally well.
Great presentation, guys. Love the modern data stack approach. Our team also kind of uses DBT, a few other open source tools as well. Curious to know, in terms of kind of like scaling out your DBT practices, are you guys kind of like just, do you have like one DBT repository, or do you guys now have multiple? And how do you guys scale that across your business units?
Yeah, no, I love the question. We do have multiple DBT projects. We use some tooling that is helpful, like we use this Power User extension that you've probably used if you've worked with DBT. We've actually developed our own VS Code extension internally as well that kind of sits on top of that and provides a bit more structure to our models, because a DBT project, if left unchecked, can get really messy. So we kind of have a framework that we've added to enforce the structure. It tries to align with the best practices you'd read about in their docs, like staging layers, intermediate, marts, and but it forces that a bit. So you can't actually contribute models to our projects that don't adhere with that. You still need to validate the accuracy of the SQL and the joins, and add tests to again make sure that this new set of SQL models that's coming into your pipeline isn't going to break anything else. And it's going to be scalable, right? Because Workday has some huge data sets internally, and if you write a bad query and then try to have your data pipeline run that, it's just going to really slow things down. But yeah, it is a constant balance. You open up SQL to a bunch of people, and even if they're good, you can still make a mistake and do something in an inefficient way. So we do build tooling to manage that. And one thing I'll also add is, Lightdash it's really built for presenting DBT-powered data. So it's a BI tool that is like purpose-built for DBT projects, and it makes it a lot easier to visualize the outputs, even like do previews. So as you're doing development, you'll spin up your own preview of that end result in Lightdash that that you can see, you can interact with, but it doesn't actually become the main kind of dashboard or table within Opus until it's been reviewed, merged through a PR, and then deployed through the CI/CD process.
Great presentation, y'all. So you had a really cool example of a query you ran, like which developers running the most expensive training models. So like what's your tagging, labeling strategy look like, or what metadata do you require to get that level of insight?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think, again, part of that is enforced by what additional information you have to provide with our request to that central inference service. And I know your request is more around training than inference, but it's a similar concept of, in order for this request to go through, you need to provide this additional metadata about that request. And it's just, like you were talking about, so that we can later on go map that with, our cloud billing infrastructure. Because there's those multiple layers of abstraction, past the node, past the unit of compute, and you got to be able to match that up through Kubernetes and the pod and then Ray. And so the only way to do that is you require additional context with those requests, like as they're made by developers. And some of those can be, pre-built. So, if it's coming from internal tooling, you put a wrapper around it and you make sure that all requests through that come with these same labels about what tool was doing that. And it's the same concept for building a feature in the external Workday product. You can make sure that API request is knowledgeable about where it was being made from, what it was being made for. So I'd say additional tooling like sending with the request can really help in making sure that it's going to come with the right data that can now be used to map everything downstream or upstream.
Hey everyone, producer Andrew here. Thank you so much for watching and for your support. For more FinOps X 2025 content, go check out our YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and leave comments and questions for all of our wonderful speakers. We appreciate your support.